Ex Nihilo. Talking to Dear Hussein, Aboubakr, Mansour, we are very much looking forward to our conversation, not least because we have learned a great deal in preparing for it. If you studied Arab intellectual history as a Westerner, you may have read Bernard Lewis and ask yourself, what went wrong? But the question remains, isn't the answer still lacking? Your perspective is very intriguing here. It prompts the question of to what extent German romanticism, at least what has developed into metaphysics or political theology, has influenced the worldview of modern Arabs. You write, philosophy of history, not Abbasid scholasticism, is the true worldview of modern Arabs, and revolution, not Islam, is the main organizing principle. Before delving deeper into this, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself? What interested young Hussein Aboubakr Mansour, who was captivated by this prehistory at the very moment the end of history was declared? What is your Bildungsroman like?
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me on. Well, these questions really never vanished in the Middle East. As a matter of fact, in Arab societies, you feel them in their most immediate weight and pressure. So, for example, I do remember the first time I ever heard of Fukuyama's End of History, for instance. It was actually from Arab intellectuals who were deriding it as this fictitious liberal work that talks about the end of history while we're still in the middle of it. And I have to say they turned out to be right. But the idea that something is terribly wrong or went wrong in modern Arab societies is really the central question, has been for nearly a century in Arab societies themselves. As a matter of fact, one could locate the question of there are many formulations for it. Why did we go backwards? Why haven't we progressed? Is really as the central animating question of entire Arab intellectual modernity. So when I was young in Egypt in the 90s and the early 2000s and starting to be intellectually curious about the world, of course, you have to encounter this question everywhere. And of course, the various answers of it, and also the intrinsic connection between it and the question of Israel, Zionism, Jews, Palestine. As a matter of fact, I would say that the question of Israel-Palestine is the central both answer and mechanism through which this question has been discussed, articulated, so on and so forth. And so I just decided to engage in it, or was engaged. I don't think that you decide. You're simply grasping two questions. And I ended up thinking about it very differently than most of the people who usually think about it. And yet through my life, a lot of things happened in the Middle East. Meanwhile, you had massive transformations in the years of the 2000s, the rise of Jihadism, 9/11, you had the Intifadas, and then you had, of course, the culmination of a lot of these events, which was the Arab Spring. And my own research and activities and writing also caused me a lot of trouble with the Egyptian state at the time. And I ended up having to leave, and I left in 2012 and have been living in the United States.
After the Arab Spring.
After the Arab Spring.
During
the Arab Spring, it was a moment of jumping ship, kind of the perfect moment. And I ended up in the United States, and then I continued really trying to figure out these questions since then.
We saw in one of your interviews that as a child you were taken with an Egyptian book series called A Man of the Impossible, which features a Muslim superhero who exposed and foils Jewish conspiracies, and how you were obsessed with a childlike magical fantasy world similar to what we have in the West of Lord Sauron or Voldemort. It wasn't only bewildering to you, but it filled you with a real revulsion, even hatred. Historically speaking, considering how many Jews, even if they were second-class dhimmi, lived in Arabia before 1947, isn't this anti-Semitic indoctrination of childhood a relatively recent development? Perhaps one that's almost become an unquestioned article of faith. We had this conversation with Morel Borelli, who is an American Jew that after relocating to Israel, wanted to learn Arabic. So he goes on the internet and pretends to be this Mick from New York who offers English in exchange for Arabic lessons. And he has hundreds of Arabic conversational partners. And because they grow close over time and they develop this kind of friendship, there is always this instant for him when, in the blink of an eye, he decides to come clean, telling him, I am Jewish and I live in Israel. And almost always the response was, Israel doesn't exist. What shattered the anti-Semitic caricature from your childhood?
I wouldn't say it was. There was a moment of kind of eureka and kind of sudden enlightenment. I think it was a period of painful, slow realization that this caricature, which is sadly is foundational. I mean, that's really the problem. It's foundation for modern Arab culture, and this is what I try. I try to explore in my writings. How did this happen? How did this character become a foundation of modern Arab culture, modern Arab self-image, modern Arab self-understanding, so on and so forth, and how that in itself seeped into with the religious revival in the 1970s, seeped into the religious kind of rereading of theology itself, that now you have a fundamentally anti-Semitic understanding of the self, of Islam, so on and so forth. But yeah, we growing up in that, it's really it's very fundamental. It's
Sure.
You don't even question it. You don't realize that it even exists, right?
Yeah.
And I basically, my way out of it was through it. It was not by any other way. That is, I actually loved the obsession. As you talk about,
it's nice to have an enemy.
It's a great story. It's like Lord of the Rings. Think about how many people love Lord of the Rings. A lot. And it also has political connotations for a lot of people. Now, imagine if you actually think it's real. That is, you have a version of it that is not even symbolic. It's supposedly it's real. No, those villains exist. It's Israel. It's that Star of David, so on and so forth. And it's believed in by everybody around you. So it's not even like a little child fantasy world. No, actually, everybody believes this. A big part of cultural production does this: movies, TV shows, comic books. As I said, I still have actually some of them. I bought them kind of a nostalgia to wonderful. You can imagine these, Pulp Fiction illustrations and covers of, just that. So I actually followed up on the obsession. I wanted to be engaged in this cosmic struggle between good and evil, and I wanted to learn everything I could, about those evil Mordor dwellers and their dark language and so on and so forth. So my way through it was through the obsession itself, and I started really teaching myself everything could about Jews and Israel. The internet was a great help at the time. Now the internet. And I'm sure you remember this. The internet back then was very different than now. The internet today is a swamp of all kinds of witches and dark animals. And back then the internet was new. It wasn't really there was a limited amount of information, but kind of almost reliable. So you could, for example, when YouTube came on, I think in 2005, I could find videos from Israel, from Israeli TV, people. And that kind of obsession led me to kind of fixate my gaze on Israel and on Judaism and Jews. And ultimately, I realized in the process that what I'm seeing is a complete and utter mismatch to what I have believed the world to be. And as I said, it was a painful realization because the fact that it became fundamental means that losing it is equivalent to a disintegration of your self-understanding. And that's the tragedy, I think, of a lot of modern Arab culture, that it tied its own modern development into self-understanding with anti-Semitism, that losing the former almost means the disintegration of the latter, which actually I did go through, kind of going through a period of disintegration and reconstitution and so on and so forth.
Losing the enemy would cause kind of like a phantom pain, would it? But how was your environment reacting to you kind of like alienating yourself from this very like foundational myth of society, like in friends, family and the like?
Yeah. Well, family didn't really know much about what I was doing.
Okay, so the secret.
You're a secret nerd, sitting in a computer and with all these books all days. Nobody really knows, and nobody's expecting that you're doing something. Your friends. The good thing about friends, especially at young age and so on, that they just think you're crazy. I mean, everybody has a.
Okay.
I know this story.
Yeah, you have in the group of friends, there's a person who's obsessed with this, and the other person who's obsessed with this, and you're the weird guy who's obsessed with this.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was like that, but it wasn't really until 2009, 2010 when I actually started. It started to become more than just this nerdish obsession. I actually started to log online, and I even attempted to visit the Israeli embassy, just to meet people there. That's when things all of a sudden get serious, because obviously the government had full surveillance over this, and all of a sudden the state security or the Egyptian Secret Service was knocking on our door, and that changed everything because then my family. Then I had a fallout pretty much. It was a very difficult time from 2010 till I left in 2012. Because all of a sudden, before that moment, so before I attempted to visit the Israeli embassy, Hussein didn't exist for the Egyptian government. As far as the Egyptian government was concerned, Hussein was just a name in the ledger. He didn't exist as a person. But all of a sudden, I existed for them. They actually knew me. And they started going, through my stuff online and so on and so forth. And that caused, as I said, 2 years of this misadventures with the state security. And that's why I eventually had to leave. Not to mention, of course, the fallout with the family.
I see. In your essay, Enchantment of the Arabian Mind, you can recount the story of Rifa'a al-Tahtawi, who was sent to Paris in 1826 by the Ottoman governor Muhammad Ali Pasha as part of a small delegation. The context is quite understandable. With European military superiority during the Napoleonic occupation, the Egyptians faced their own fragility. It was a matter of demonstrating that they too could be worthy opponents. This story later was echoed in Japan's Meiji Revolution, and indeed, Tahtawi returned to Cairo with new revolutionary ideas, concepts such as Hurriya, liberty, Tamadun, civilization, and Takadum, progress. And suddenly, a new liberal school of thought emerged in the Arab world, which had only started using the printing press in the early 19th century. Now, books were written and translated, and eventually the Marxist-inspired Society of Egyptian Progress was established. Tell us more about this development.
This is considered traditionally. It's known in the historical literature as the Nahda period. Nahda is an Arabic word that means Renaissance, and it basically talks about this kind of a prelude to modern Arab societies as they are today. It's a period of rapid modernization that was state-led, particularly in Egypt. It was happening somewhere else, but Egypt is the central story here. And Rifa'a al-Tahtawi himself is considered to be the beginning of that intellectual and cultural Arab modernity. Now, there's a question. So most of the narrative talks about it in terms of continuity. So especially the Arab nationalists, a lot of our modern historiography about the Middle East, I would say, took for granted, sadly, a lot of Arab nationalist narratives about themselves. But I think there is actually a large discontinuity. There were periods in which things changed. But that first period, that foundational period, was a period after, as you said, the Napoleonic occupation of Egypt, after it had left. It led to massive transformation in society, especially ways of civil organizations that organized themselves to resist the French at the time. And that ultimately led to the coming to power of Muhammad Ali Pasha, who's traditionally considered to be the founder of modern Egypt. And Muhammad Ali Pasha wanted to modernize, and he largely succeeded. Egypt became the most formidable province in the Ottoman Empire, to the extent that it actually almost defeated the Sultan himself, and almost took charge. If it wasn't for the Europeans that prevented it, but Muhammad Ali Pasha proved to be an extremely shrewd statesman. didn't know Arabic. I read in some accounts he was even illiterate. Technically, I'm not exactly sure that this is true, but he was an Albanian officer who was a part
He
of
was
the.
from Albania.
He was
Okay.
Albanian, yeah. He was
Weird.
Albanian, part of the garrison, the Ottoman garrison. He had good relationship with the Egyptian religious authorities, and they basically then forced, after the French left, they forced the Sultan to appoint him as the Wali, or the ruler of Egypt, because before he basically almost made it independent for his own. And after he became the ruler of Egypt, he started on this massive program of modernization, which included first of all, modernizing the military. That's the central task. The military at the time was called Divan Jihadiyya, or the Diwan, or the Ministry of Jihad. And the Ministry of Jihad, and that's very different jihad than how we understand it today. It was institutional warfare, just the tradition, the stately tradition of organized war and defense that all states have. It was called Diwan Jihadiyya, and it did actually many functions. That is, it did public works, for example. So Diwan Jihadiyya wasn't just responsible, it was maybe responsible for what now 9 ministries would be responsible for. So it would be responsible for education, it would be responsible for public works, and that was the primary vehicle of modernization, actually. So that's also an ironic thing that people wouldn't think about, that jihad was technically speaking, the Ministry of Jihad was actually the bulwark of modernization of Egyptian society. Rifa'a Tahtawi worked for as a young scholar, just traditional Islamic scholar, worked for Diwan the Jihadiyya as kind of just an imam, and he himself was not actually supposed to be the great modernizer. He was just sent with the delegation of young Egyptian students, mostly military officers, to take care of their religious needs, to Paris, while they were studying in Paris for a number of years. And of course, he ended up, we don't know the names of any one of them. We actually know only his name. He ended up being the brightest person of that delegation. He spent an immense amount of time, first of all, learning French, talking to French professors, French philosophers. And he came back and he started writing first of all, his most famous book is The Extraction of Gold. That's what it's called, in which basically he is telling people about what he saw in Paris, which was a document of great importance for multiple reasons. And then he starts building this educational infrastructure. He actually becomes Muhammad Ali Pasha. He does appoint him a person who's responsible for much of the educational modernization. He builds, which still exists in Egypt today, a college. It's called the Tongues College, or Al-Alsun, which is basically a school of translation, because he understood that the first thing is learning languages, translating what these people are writing.
Sure.
And out of this effort, not to mention, of course, publishing, printing press, so on and so forth, starting a whole editorial industry in which old books were now edited, verified, so on and so forth, kind of introducing modern philology, basically. And then you had this explosion of intellectual output that lasted for a very long time. And because it was primarily inspired by the French, it remained tied fundamentally and epistemologically to French positivism. That is, it understood the world through French categories, French images of politics, of statehood, of history. And even as nationalism itself developed, it was at its beginning, it was this French understanding. Only by the late 19th century, you start seeing, by that time, of course, you have a much bigger, Rifa'a Tahtawi was a person. By the way, he also translated to Arabic Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws.
Makes sense. Like.
So also it's very important to remember that it was the Ministry of Jihad that translated Montesquieu.
Very funny, like the specter of the guy.
So, and by the end of the 19th century, you have, of course, a whole milieu. Now you have a big literacy, or a much wider. It's still a minority in the population, but it's a much larger. Basically, you have the beginning of a modern bourgeois. And by that time, you start seeing then the influence of other ideas. You start seeing, as you said, there started to have groups of students who come back, instead of French positivist ideas, they come back with Marxist ideas of history, of progress, political economy. And by the late 19th century, you do have you can see it very clearly, this kind of new literature that speaks about change, about the laws of history, and about revolution. And it remained, I would say it remained confused. I mean, it's a very confusing process for a few decades, but really it didn't come to fruition until the interwar years. But also, it's not just that it was working itself. You have to remember that the influence was constant. So also, as these modes of thought, whether Marxism or romantic nationalism, the influence was constant. And by the interwar years, you start getting a political reality or a political community that never existed before, that is trying to walk lockstep with Europe, with the developments that we're having in Europe at the time.
It's interesting. It's here during this period that something unusual occurs that you're talking about. Suddenly there's many Arab thinkers who begin appropriating German idealism, Hegel's dialectics, and romanticisms, right? Particularly as this political theology. And as in the case with Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida, founding figures of Muslim Brotherhood. And to some extent, this is understandable because, as we say, Hegel's Weltgeist and Fichte's division of the self and non-self all emerged in the shadow of the Napoleonic occupation.
Right.
Isn't it precisely this identitarian resistance that finds its way into the Arab culture? You write very concisely, herein lies the paradox of Rida, his circle, and his spiritual heirs. On the one hand, they wanted to create an Islamic revival, and on the other, they completely transformed the meaning of Islam, shifting its gravity from law and revelation to man and history in the world. Doesn't this suggest that you will fundamentally misunderstand Arab intellectual world by only focusing on religion, and that it would be much more appropriate considering modern term counter-enlightenment in this context?
I agree, and I think the problem is that you have inadequate historicization, and you have the constant tendency, which is very normal, to project the concerns of today onto the past. So since the late 1970s, increasingly the main concerns and issues and problems and crises in Middle Eastern societies have been Islamist movements specifically. You had the Iranian Revolution, you had the increasing popularity of the Muslim Brotherhood, you had the rise of Hamas and Hezbollah. You had basically an orientation of all of the trying to understanding of Middle Eastern history through that crisis. That, okay, these are Islamist, it's a religious issue. And of course, here what these groups talk about themselves, they talk about themselves as this, unbroken chain of 1,400 years tradition, right? So you take also their word for granted. They are talking about they are not getting anything new. They were restoring Islam. And you'll find all of the language in talking about this talks about resurgence. So the resurgence of Islam, the return of Islam, so on and so forth. But yes, if you actually adequately historicized, that is, you actually looked at the various historical periods, you'll find that the story is actually very, very different. That is to say, it's a return of Islam. You have a leap that really erases maybe 150 years of the most consequential, transformational history of modern Arab societies. You're basically saying that those 150 years really meant nothing. It was just ephemera. They were trying to become European, but they failed, so they went back. And that's I think that's the fixed. So they went back.
Interesting.
Which I think this itself is a myth. It's a mythological understanding of the world, because things don't work that way. If you really then follow the story, you see, as you said, you see the first of all, you have this wave of modernization, which is just cultural flares, education, school systems, so on and so forth. And then you get Muhammad Abdu and Afghani, or they are not the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood. They are a founder of an Islamic revival thought from which came the Muslim Brotherhood later.
Right.
You then start finding a whole different way of talking about Islam and talking about the world that didn't exist even in the days of Tahtawi. Only in the period, and that shows you one of the things that I just learned from this research is just how rapid a change can be in such a very short time, how dramatic. That is, in a period of 50 years after Tahtawi, you get a whole different world mentally, a whole different mental world image. You have people who are talking, first of all, they are internalizing clearly a version of the philosophy of history. That is, history has a meaning. It marches in a certain rhythm. There are laws to it. And it marches through individualities or individual personalities. And one of those is called Islam, and Islam is a civilization. You're already here moving to a complete modern reconceptualization of the self, of Islam, from what it has been till like a moment ago. And now you're identifying with this civilizational individuality. You're trying to discover its fate, the judgment of history on it, so on and so forth. And that comes, you see it in the works of beginning of Abdu, and you see it in the works of Ghani, and you see it, of course, in the works of Rashid Rida. By Rashid Rida, you truly have the settlement of this civilizational understanding of Islam, or Islam as a civilization, a moving civilization in history that is now in decline, and that it needs a resurrection. And actually, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, was indeed a student of Rida himself. And by the time you get al-Banna, here you have the transformation or the merging. I mean, al-Banna itself, he was not a great thinker. He was a school teacher, but he was living through that times. He was very engaged in this. And you can see in many of the things that he left us his own confusion. But really, you see the merging of that, even that 19th century. Okay, the thing about modern intellectual history itself, that it also it rapidly moves from itself.
Oh, sure.
That is, established time for 10, 20 years. All of a sudden, it falls, and you have another one. In al-Banna, you see the merging of two paradigms. The 19th century civilizational European paradigm, seeing the world through the history of civilizations.
Progress and so forth.
Which is, it was a certain concept of progress. And then you see also the interwar era of big ideology. You see Marxism, you see romantic nationalism, and basically Hassan al-Banna is basically the link that then made the transformation from Rida and al-Afghani's own civilizational understanding, which was more French, I would say. And then all of a sudden you have Islam as an ideology, that it's not a civilization, it's really a total conception of life. And that's, you get that merging with romanticism. That also was, al-Banna didn't read German literature. It was just common, it was becoming common in Arabic culture itself.
I would say like political theology and like the Kiliastic thinking is a really wonderful way of overcoming like the discontent of modernity. And the discontent of modernity was even playing out like in the France of Edouard Drummond, like in the late 19th century. All of a sudden, like anti-Semitism got a big thing, etc. You see it like playing out all over. So in a way, you could say like the Arab world kind of like was a big repercussion what already happened like in Europe, and maybe even like amplified.
Well, there was this curious. I learned a lot reading this. There's this moment with Abdu, who, he joins Freemasonry. He becomes a Freemason. And then he meets Rida as a student, I think, and he says, "Why are you a Freemason?" And they published this essay in 1903 talking about how Freemasonry is an anti-Semitic tool. I mean, it's just a really weird time that all of this is happening.
And it shows you how they were becoming, their own lives were becoming an extension of Europe. I mean, that's really what we have to be honest here. I mean, that's really the globalization. You have a remarkable level of globalization when you have the elites of these colonial societies at the moment of modernization really making their own societies an extension of European history, joining Freemasonry because Freemasonry is about fraternity and freedom and progress and civilization and so on and so forth. And then at the same time, you have Rashid Rida himself wrote actually one of the most interesting probably the earliest Arabic document on anti-Semitism as a distinct phenomena. It was about the Dreyfus affair, and in which
makes sense.
Of course.
He was scolding the French, he's saying, and he was explaining, and you see, it's very important to read these things because then you see it through their eyes. How did they see the world? He was even trying to explain to his readers that they shouldn't suspect that the French are persecuting those poor Jews because they are religious. As a matter of fact, the French are closer to irreligion than to religion. So he's telling them, the French, by the way, this is not because of religion. People are atheists. they are persecuting the Jews because they are envious of their success. I actually love this article because also it's central in epistemic analysis because he says they are envious of their success and their ability to make money and so on and so forth. And then at the end of the article, he says, and that he spoke to this French thinker who told him that this is a disease. But hopefully, with the progress of virtue, people will come to grant other people freedom to pursue their interests. Already here, you have a complete modern understanding of modern society. You have a concept of progress. You have a concept of virtue, which is a central enlightenment, a moral philosophy principle. You have the concept of freedom, which is the organizing principle of modern political philosophy. And you have the principle of interest, which is a central... So you already see in these movies complete transformations. And here's my claim, that once you adopt... So the Enlightenment created this avalanche of all of these cognitive tools, artifacts. Once you adopt one of them, it's irreversible. I don't think it's possible to go back to anything. So even as Rida himself, so Rida at that period was kind of this enlightened Rida, who's continuing the line really from Tahtawi to Abdu to liberalism, and he himself embodies that change that happened, because then he becomes angry later in his life. He becomes a more resentful of the West, and he becomes deeply anti-Zionist, if not to say anti-Semitic himself. Here is the question: was that transformation in Rida's personality return to a pre-Enlightenment, before he understood virtue and interest, or is it another step in another modern direction? And that's what I think. This is another step.
Of course.
Because modernity has many options. We have almost endless options. Some of them are terrible. And that was really a step in one of the terrible possibilities for being modern.
Examining the dynamics between the Nakba's narrowed reinterpretation, we find that Constantin Zureiq, a Syrian Greek Orthodox studying at Princeton, initially coined the term catastrophe to raise the Arab world's awareness of its significant technological, social, and intellectual backwardness. He envisioned a united Arab nation, as described in his 1939 nationalist consciousness, where, drawing on German idealism as well as Marxism, the narrative of oppression was already in place. But ultimately, the British and French were on the way out, leaving only the Jews, the evil Zionists and the puppeteers of oppression. Right. And in 1947, when the Arabs were defeated by the Israelis, Zureiq shifts Nakba's meaning. Quote, 7 Arab states declared war on Zionism and Palestine, yet they stood impotent. What happened next with the Nakba? How did it transform over time, as you note, into one of the most catastrophic forces in the Middle East?
The Nakba itself, I think, is a great concept to trace its meaning in order also to understand big parts of that intellectual history. So when Zureiq, first of all, Zureiq himself was writing in a modern, he was shaped in the interwar years. He was actually a professor, guess of what? Of history, naturally.
Sure. The Weltgeist is always revealing himself like an historical.
There's a background to this. So the first modern college in the Middle East, not the first modern Arab college, that would be really in Egypt, but in the Middle East, the first modern was actually a Protestant, what's called the Syrian Protestant College, which is today the American University of Beirut, which was established in the mid-19th century, and really offered this modern university education. The first modern Arab document that talks about the philosophy of history was actually written in the Syrian Protestant College by an American missionary. Was speaking Arabic. He was a professor of history, and it was an article, an essay wrote maybe in the 1870s, and it was titled "The Philosophy of History." And he was trying to explain to Arabs that what they understand about history is not real history. What they understand about history is the traditional annals and chronologies of dynasties and kings and so on. That's not really what big history means. Big history means the totality of history in which you can grasp the meaning of history. Of course, all of this was new. Now, history has a meaning. It's not just a collection of what people used to do even in Europe, till Bishop Busset, right? It's a collection of names and dates of kings and rulers and so on. And Porter was telling the Arabs, that's not real history. That's not, forget about that. That's just history is when you understand the totality, that then you through it you grasp the meaning. And he taught in the Syrian Protestant college for a while. Zureiq took over his chair. That is actually he was successor. So he's also a very important figure. Because here you have Harvey Porter, who is an American missionary, and then basically in the next generation you have a native, a local, who was an Orthodox Christian, Constantin Zureiq. He studied at the in Beirut, and then he went and got his PhD, I think, in Princeton, and then went back and actually took over Porter's chair, and he taught there in the 1930s. And he was the most important articulator of Arab nationalism during that year. As a matter of fact, the document that really sparked the fire that became Arab nationalism and the decolonization revolution after World War II was really a book that was written by Zureiq, or a group of lectures published in 1939. So he was already established as the philosopher of meaning of history for a lot of people then. So when the defeat of 1948 happens, what he was doing, he was giving the meaning. He was now in charge of interpreting history for Arabs, and he was writing. All of his writings are almost in this. There is a style that, for me, I can identify. It became a style of rhetorical style that was really popular in France. I think it still is. It also very popular in German Marxist, or in general Marxist and Romantic nationalist writing, which is salvation through catastrophe. Right?
Yeah.
You start by saying, today we are in a catastrophe. This is the end
now
of
comes
the
the
world.
big turn.
Yes, and then basically you're going to tell me what to do in order to avoid this catastrophe, right? That style became a central style of writing for Arabs for a very long time. I would say till today. Zureiq wrote in that style. So even forget about the meaning of the Nakba book. If you read even any other book he wrote, it almost starts with the same thing. Oh, we are now facing the precipice. We are at the edge of the abyss. We are. So it kind of starts by laying this doom and Said Qutb, by the way, who's central to
same story. Yeah.
He also wrote in the same tradition, rhetorical tradition. So the meaning of the Nakba was like this. It was written before the war was ended, and basically the Nakba means the catastrophe. So he was saying now we're facing the catastrophe. And it was his way. It actually had nothing to do with it, despite that he did attach to it this anti-Semitic essay that he wrote earlier. He attached it to the end of the book. So aside from the anti-Semitism, the book actually had nothing to do with Israel. The book was about his own ideology of revolution and pan-Arabism, and basically dissolving now the independent states. As you said, the English and the French were leaving, and they are leaving independent states. So this is a huge disappointment. So almost the French and the British leaving was not a good thing. It was a bad thing. Because they are leaving
They were not united.
Exactly. They are leaving fragmented states. They made a kingdom in Jordan. They are leaving an independent Lebanon, an independent Syria, and now Israel is taking a chunk. And so basically they are leaving these fragmented countries. So in a way, or basically what Zureiq was saying, is saying that this defeat, this catastrophe, verifies, or the empirical verification of my thesis, that Arabs have no existence until they are united. And here you have this romantic notion of fulfillment and existence and becoming an actual agent in history through the will. You acquire the will, and the will you acquire through unity. And that was what was his doing. And that was the concept of the Nakba as he established it. It had nothing to do with the Palestinians. It had nothing to do with refugees. He actually says that this is not about all of these people. This is about basically the political fragmentation. So the Nakba was actually this romantic concept that's almost about a metaphysical reality. That's how it started. It was about the metaphysics of unity and the will. That's how the concept started.
A little question. So is it a problem for the Arab world that like a Greek Orthodox, like Christian, like coined like a pan-Arabism? It's a little bit like Lawrence of Arabia, is it? Like it's like kind of a parody. Even. Like, for example, why do you need somebody like not being like educated in the Quran, like being the founding father here?
They really didn't. I mean, the leaders of, so after that first generation of the liberal thinkers that were primarily came from a religious background, the second leader of the radical thinkers were actually almost entirely Christian.
Really?
Which is a really terrible historical, it's terrible in a way, but really that almost the entire leaders of Arab radicalism, the founders of Arab radicalism, are actually Levantine Christians. Whether the traditions of Arab Marxism and communism, or the traditions of Arab nationalism, and ironically, all the way up to the beginning of Islamism. As a matter of fact, some of the leaders of Islamism were Levantine Christians who decided to convert to Islam in the 1970s under Maoist influence because they thought that this is the next revolution.
This is so funny.
So it's tragic. I mean, if you think about what happened to Levantine Christianity, I mean it's horrible. It's horrible.
Like in the 70s,
So people didn't have that problem, and maybe that was one of the motivation of this Christian Levantine radicalism. I mean, it's really transcending the confessional world of Ottoman society into a world in which they can become equal and leaders and join politics and so on. So Constantin Zureiq was essential. So to go back to the Nakba for a moment. So the concept itself, when it started, it was really about this metaphysics of the will and unity as a catalyst for a revolution. And that's how it was used till the 1960s, till the mid-60s. That's basically, the Nakba was not really about the Palestinians. It's about the need for revolution. And once that revolution received actual states, that is, it became an actual force in Nasser and al-Ba'ath, the Nakba became a weapon with which to fight those Arab leaders who stuck to their independence. So whether it was King Hussein in Jordan or the Saudis. Now, just very quickly, and here when the intellectual history goes along with the political developments, the Arab, whether the Ba'ath or Nasser, one of their primary goals was to have access to the Arab Gulf oil. So one of their main enemies, they really were fighting three forces. They had a trinity of enemies: Zionism, imperialism, so basically the West, and Arab reaction. And by the Arab reaction, they meant the Gulf states that are basically controlling all the oil and living under the protection of the British and the Americans. And I would say that this last was actually the most important. So the Nakba was the weapon to agitate publicly in order to get people angry. And you had the radio of Cairo calling for assassinations of these kings, calling for revolutions, and so on. And that's with the period. Now, with the rise of the Palestinians didn't exist thus far. The Palestinians will come to existence only basically after the 6-Day War. You had the development of Fatah in the early 60s, yes, the Palestinian students, but really you don't get an actual Palestinian movement before the 6th War, before 1967, and then they take over the Nakba concept. Now, the Nakba is no longer a pan-Arab, it's about the Palestinians as the new bulwarks of this revolution. You have a period of change if that concept becomes more Palestinian specifically. By the 90s, it starts to enter the Western high culture and Western academic culture. You started to get here and there public. I mean, Edward Said helped a lot, but even then it was still, I mean, you had to agree with a fundamental claims of the Palestinian national movement in order to just use the concept. By the 1990s, you get the beginning of what became really the Nakba studies, Nakbology. You get a different. You had, for example, Layla Bouloughed, who was the daughter of Ibrahim Bouloughed, who was actually the teacher of Edward Said, one of the inspirations of Edward Said. She edits this volume, Nakba, and then by the 2000s, you really get an explosion. And by that time, the Nakba have been transformed entirely from how it was actually conceived by Constantin Zureiq as the metaphysics of unity and will, and almost a fascist concept in its content, into this progressive leftist concept that's kind of equivalent to the Holocaust. So it talks about this fundamental, inescapable crimes of capitalist modernity that really expresses a way even much larger condition than the Palestinians themselves. So the Nakba itself is kind of one of those indictments that show the inherent injustice and oppression and exploitation with which the modern world is formed. So basically, what you get a reversion to a metaphysical version that's, I would say, even wider than the one that Constantin Zureiq envisioned. The ones that Zureiq envisioned, by the end of the day, was limited to his conception of Arab.
It's still a positive, like conceiving idea of like uniting Arabia, etc. Whereas the Nakba, in this sense, is like just like the invention of the victim, so to speak, like a metaphysical victim. Again, the funny thing is, like maybe like one of these turning points might be Michel Foucault like visiting the Iranian like theocracy and speaking about like political spirituality, which is like a fun, like a joke, but like he was taking it very deadly serious.
It wasn't just him. All the post-colonial authors. So as I said, you had those. So you had generations. For example, Munir Shafiq is the most famous of this Levantine Christian radicals who were leading Arab thought. Who, like they said, you know what? By the 70s, listen, Arabism is dying, Marxism is dying, Islam is the next party.
Big thing.
We convert and we start a revolution there. You had a lot of people doing this. You had even Salman Rushdie, for instance. Here is an example. So, who before the revolution came for his head, he celebrated the Iranian Revolution. He actually wrote an essay at the beginning of the 80s, romanticizing, and you can think in these romantic revolutionary terms, and how Islam, since it started, it's a subversive radical revolution. So the subaltern, and that's what Khomeini is bringing back. Obviously, Rushdie will be knocked back into sense after this subversive radicalism issues its fatwa. But it's Foucault. It's all of these intellectuals.
We found it very intriguing how you highlighted the radicalization of Arabia, featuring figures like Arafat, the Iranian theocracy, groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, and ultimately the death cults of ISIS. All as a kind of parallel narrative of Western figures like Che Guevara, Frantz Fanon, and Rege Jabre, all framed as the radical chic of identity politics. You point out that the year 1967 as when the New Left emerged, noting its strange influence on the Arab world. By the late 1960s, you write, Arab culture had almost totally politicized. Every novel a sermon, every poem a call to arms, every song a military march, every film a theology of struggle. This approach is most illuminating as it highlights the strange alliances emerging from October 7th, referred to in French as the Islamic leftism. When the world is divided into oppressors and the oppressed, civilizers and colonizers, and those robbed of their land, you end up with all of these unholy alliances. Composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen described the burning of the Twin Towers as the greatest work of art in our time. And after September 11th, even Jean Baudelaire acknowledged the terrorist superiority. We have life, they have death. But in reality, isn't this terror nothing more than the grimace of counter-modernity?
Yes, I mean the idea is that this Arab and Muslim radicalism, it's part of modern radicalism in general as it emerged in Europe in the 19th century, and as 19th century European culture became global, it really decomposed into various forms. In a lot of places. What people don't get the importance of historicizing chronologically correctly is things about Islamism and jihadism, that once you do that, you start understanding that the Islamist was actually a post-leftist. He was a leftist in the 40s. He's a leftist in the 50s, 60s, and in the 70s. By the time of the rising of the New Left, you really have a major decomposition of the largest modern ideologies, and the largest modern ideologies among intellectuals at the time was, of course, Marxism with its various forms. And a lot of postmodernism and postmodern discourse was primarily post-Marxist. I mean, intellectually. I'm not talking about the social development. I'm talking about the intellectual post-structuralist and postmodernist thinkers were primarily post-Marxist. Now, the form that these transformations, social movements, identity politics, conceiving a revolution against authority in various forms, these developments, which basically the rise of the new left, also happened in the Middle East. In local forms, the rise of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, the PLO, was actually part of this. The PLO was basically conceived itself as the new revolution against the old revolution. That is, the old revolution failed of the big ideologies, the Stalin-style figures of Nasser. Now we need a new liberation movement, so on and so forth. Now, Islamist and jihadist movements started also the same way. I mean, first of all, you had various origins of this. You had the actual, you have people like Said Qutb, the writings of people like Said Qutb that started. And Said Qutb was deeply a romanticist figure. His conception of Islam is actually almost entirely atheistic. His understanding of the Quran is as a romantic hermeneutic in which you shape a human existence with. That's one origin. You have another origin was basically the Palestinian Maoist movements, who decided that they need to descend to the masses and reach the masses where they are. And if the masses are in the mosque, we're going to go radicalize them in the mosque. That's one origins. You have multiple. You have, of course, Iran. You had the marriage of French existentialism, Sufism, Marxism, and Shiaism in the figure like Ali Shariati, who was one of the most important ideological figures for the Islamic Revolt. And then all of this fermentation that is now by the 1970s is out of control, because also you have a transformation of information technology. You have now ways of information and media that the governments can no longer really control, like cassette tapes, for instance. Greater literacy, so on and so forth. You have the rising of all of these movements that entirely depended in their epistemic formation in the ways that the new left, or basically this mid-century forms of radicalism, in which Fanon was a major figure, right? And Fanon himself is deeply Hegelian. It's that only through the murder of the colonizer that the colonized annihilate themselves and really become free, right? This idea was very central, for instance, to the development of the Palestinian movement itself. And you see it in various forms in their literature. It's very disturbing. You see it in their literature, in their political understanding of even what Palestine is, as primarily the annihilation. It has really no content other than the erasure of Israel. So you have all of these ideas. Now imagine that those people then 10 years later, as they are thinking this way, then became religious, right? And then they baptized, so to speak, if I can be permitted the wrong metaphor, baptized in a religious language, and then you have a whole Islamic theology and eschatology that talks, first of all, already Islamized all of these notions. So it's now a world of belief that is resurging. It's a vanguard of revolution against the Western infidel world that has planted the Jews amongst us to corrupt us, and only through the annihilation, even if through suicide bombing, that mutual annihilation, only this liberation will happen.
Yeah, you get like the Red Army fraction visiting like Palestine, etc., getting together with Arafat and the like, and the PLO hijacking like the planes, like there was like a big game. You see like a globalized world gets into global terrorism, which is a very interesting idea. Having spent a great deal of my time studying the philosophy of the machine and the cultural history of machines, I've been preoccupied with how machines take control of our unconscious. You don't need to look very far. Take the Middle Ages rework automaton, which produced mill technology, mechanical clocks, and the virtues of punctuality and tactfulness. And then you can see how what we call culture is a product of the machine. The case of the Arab world is particularly intriguing. Although ancient knowledge had been integrated, like Greek knowledge, and 10th century Baghdad was highly civilized, the Arabian world rejected the machine. That meant there was no interest And the Ottoman ruler Bayezid II could ban the printing press, even the reading of printed books on pain of death. Consequently, modernity has swept across the Arab world like a tsunami, even harder than in any European country. You write about the enormous influence of mass media, and I always had the image of Ayatollah Khomeini in mind, who used a German radio, a Volksempfänger, to broadcast anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda from Zesen and build his congregational community around him. What's your perspective on the influx of mass media in this whole story of Arab radicalization?
Well, mass media is central to this. I mean, you would not have. It's for me. I don't know. What comes up, but the era of mass politics. Mass politics cannot happen without mass.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
And you can't have really ideologies that consider their central political protagonist to be the masses, whether the mass democracy or socialism, Marxism, nationalism, so on, without having a mass media. So it's directly intertwined. So mass media doesn't start to really appear in the Middle East actually before World War II. I think actually the Italians were the pioneers. The Germans are the ones who really made something out of it. It doesn't really appear before that. Before the eve of World War II, you had the state-controlled media, elite-controlled media, because you had really ultimately it was a limited societies of literacy that had access to journals, publications, and so on and so forth. You had the attempts to construct local radio stations, but then you have in 1936 you have the Italians start
Libya.
They start the Free Voice of the Arabs, I think what it was called, to broadcast the mass. And then the Germans get the idea. And then they start Radio Zesen, in which Hajj Amin Husseini, the Mufti, after he escapes Iraq, he actually goes and works for them. They had this brilliant host, brilliant in the most terrible way possible. His name was Yunus Bahari. He was an Iraqi. He was very eloquent, with a voice like thunder, and they started broadcasting on shortwave radio almost the entirety of the Middle East. This heavy Nazi propaganda combined with readings of Quran and Arab music, and so on and so forth, and that creates a ferment and agitation. I mean, that's really that was the beginning mass ferment at that level in modern Middle Eastern history. In my opinion, it surpassed anything that the region have seen before, to the extent that the British and the French tried to ban listening, so it's illegal to listen to them in some areas. And even the BBC, so one of the most famous institutions in the 20th century is the BBC Arabic. The BBC Arabic was actually made specifically to counter the German radio. And even then, if you read some of the memoirs of the people who were, for example, his name was Nivelle, he was managing the BBC Arabic, he said it was almost impossible to counter because they basically had no scruples. They could just say anything and be enthusiastic and sensationalist, and we just at the BBC, we couldn't do what they were doing. But anyways, this period really is the foundational moment of mass media in the region. It gets picked up by Nasser. That's really so. After World War II, the demise of the Voice of Berlin, you get the Voice of Cairo at the beginning of the 50s, which basically becomes the successor of the Voice of Berlin, and through which the Nasserist regime tried to revolutionize the entire region, calling, as I said earlier, calling for assassinations of other Arab rulers, calling to every Arab to become a bullet in the weapon of self-realizing Arabism. And you really can then take this all the way up to Al Jazeera. So you can actually see that the decisive radicalizing role of mass media, how it has been the Middle East. And then you wonder, I mean, these kind of understandings also challenge a lot of things. I mean, the Arab Gulf countries have an extremely tightly controlled media environment. For example, the UAE. And you wonder, would they have been able to be the stable society in that region that they are without such control? That's completely undemocratic. Sure. But given that these are the conditions in which they are operating in, and now you have a mass media in which somebody who's either sitting in Berlin sitting in Cairo or sitting in Damascus can reach the houses of your own people and incite them day in and out, daily, against you, would you be able to produce stability without controlling that chaotic information environment?
Well, following your narrative, couldn't we say this shifting towards Islamism represents an apocalyptic and a deeply nihilistic movement? You're right. The modern Arab intellectual, like his Western counterpart, is a janitor of decay, curating the archive of dead ideas, polishing the slogans of a vanished revolution, and sweeping up the dust of meaning. This nihilism is entirely worldly as it drives its followers into a veritable passion, which raises the question, are they, like snuff film directors, killing people simply to terrify their Facebook followers? How do you think about this, the barbarism of ISIS in social media?
I think you can see it. ISIS was, I think, the culmination
of
all of, all of this terrible story of, I don't want to make everything about ideas, but of course ideas we can't deny that ideas and the way that people think are central to life. And everybody recognizes that the Middle East clearly has, Arab societies have had deeply ideological problems. Yes, they have also poverty, they have political corruption, they have lack of freedom, they have sectarianism, but all of these problems always fuel this terrible set of ideas that kept bubbling up for nearly a century now. And the culmination of all of this, these waves of destruction, waves of revolution and defeat and disillusionment and despair, and revolution and disillusionment and defeat and despair. I mean, you have various waves of this. Is really, you see it in ISIS, which, it's my generation. It's the same generation. By the way, when I was nerding out with my computer and books and comic books and trying to understand the Jews and trying to Israel, the people that became ISIS were also doing that, but also nerding out on something else. We're the same in the sleep conditions. You hear it, for example, in Syria's President Ahmad al-Shara. I heard him talk about his biography. I was shocked about how much similar our lives were, right? He grew up in the same period, watching Al Jazeera, being told about all of these babies killed by the Israelis in Palestine, killed by the Americans in Iraq. But he was different than me. He escaped from home and he found his way to Iraq to go find the Americans when he was a teenager. I stayed home to try to understand things more. But basically, it was really the culmination, because now you have this pathological vision of the self, a vision of reality, a century of defeats that is considered to be a denial from history, right? The foundation, as I said, for the philosophy of history is the fundamental view of the world here. So basically, you're outside of the history. You're outside of history. You don't exist. You have no will. You have no existence, and that's why you're defeated. You have this imagining of belonging to this large political or historical individuality that includes the Palestinians, that include Iraqis, that include all of these people, and then all of these political problems. So you have these are different political issues, right? Let's say what's happening amongst the Palestinians and the Israelis, what's happened in Iraq, what happened there. They are, of course, connected regionally and geopolitically, but ultimately, you could argue that these are different political issues. But no, all of them become the crisis of Islam, why Muslims are killed, why Muslims are defeated, and so on and so forth. And then you have the world basically devoid or vanquished of meaning entirely, and you end up ultimately, from that way of thinking, you end up in ISIS. You end up with these truly nihilistic young people who were really managing spectacles of the most gnarly violence. I remember the videos of burning people alive, the videos of beheading people, and completely lack or insist, almost the point of the video is to prove their point that these lives have no value whatsoever. And they don't know any deeper nihilism than this.
Yeah, that's very funny. You've got like DJs from Berlin, like a lot of musicians from England, etc. Third generation, like Islamic people from France, like a big, even like a size of an army going over like to ISIS and fighting like the infidels, etc. Which is crazy.
It was a truly global movement.
Absolutely. It's a postmodern.
People from every race, speaking every language.
One argument highlighting the unease in modernity is the widespread popularity that the protocols of the elders of Zion have enjoyed in the Arab world.
Right.
The Egyptian television series The Horseless Rider is based on its school books in Palestine propagated, and even Turkey, which aimed to join the European Union, had produced numerous editions of this work. Examining the protocol's history, which I dedicated a lengthy chapter to in my previous book, reveals that the original 1864 text, Maurice Joly's conversation between Montesquieu and Machiavelli in Hell, is not about Jews at all, but about modern techniques of power, the press, money, and the stock market. Later, shortly after the Zionist World Congress in Basel, a Russian agent blamed the Jews for modern technology, turning it into a global conspiracy. This is where we really see a connection to German anti-Semitism, which gained momentum after Germany lost World War I. Hitler even went so far as to say, if the Jews did not exist, one would have to invent them. Isn't the invention of the scapegoat key to the drama we are witnessing, not only in the Arab society, but also in other parts of the world?
Yeah, and then Eric Hofer had this saying, if the devil didn't exist, humanity would have had to, or no, people can stop believing in God, but they can't stop believing in the devil.
Yeah,
it's true. I mean, there's of course the work of René Girard on the scapegoat system, scapegoating for
sacred violence,
process, sacred violence. The protocols, sadly, were and are. I mean, they remain popular really in a lot of Arab societies. Actually, the show that you mentioned, I actually grew up watching. It was Ramadan 2005. I remember it because it was the most exciting show of the year about the protocol.
The cemetery.
And you have you have scenes like in these Jewish looking, of course, it's Hasidic, which means Hasidic custom. That supposedly those are the masters of. They are congregating in these dark basements around candles and they're conspiring.
Sure.
In the 19th century, the Protocols of Zion itself, I think, is actually one of our earliest postmodern literary artifacts. Right? It's a pastiche of a lot of different things. It's authorless. It's infinitely plagiarized. Itself plagiarizes other work, and itself is plagiarized in other works. Moves globally, knows no boundaries. It completely untethered from any reality, really. Yet it finds itself at home in every context. It's just an amazing.
By the way, just to interrupt you for a short moment, do you know the story of the Japanese? So the Japanese came to Israel in the 70s, etc., and they even fabricated a golden edition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and gave it to the Israelis. And the Israelis were kind of shocked what's going on here. So it's really gorgeous what you did. You mastered, you conquered the world with your technique. So by the way, for the Japanese, it was like a model even for conquering the world by industrializing, which is so funny.
And I actually just read, and you find that one of the Palestinian negotiators, I wonder if it was in the shop, was telling the Israelis, you control the world while you're only less than 1% of the population. You certainly will still be able to control us even if we were 50% of the population. And he was telling them as if don't worry, don't be afraid, you guys can control anything. So the protocols, it definitely, it's in itself, it provides almost an education into the modern world, right? You see everything happening in it. You see technology, you see capitalism, you see socialism, you see democracy, you see liberalism, you see social phenomena, you see moral decay, the degeneration of art. You see everything that people generally talk about and associate with modern living. In the 19th century specifically, there is a certain philosophical and intellectual fantasy that emerged at various points, which is basically that modernity, that we're now reached an age that is fundamentally Jewish. That there's something about the essence of modernity that's Jewish. That being modern is basically a process of Jewification of existence, and transcending this modernity would be the transcending of this Judaism. And I mean, the most famous articulation of it was basically Marx on the Jewish question, in which capitalism we need to liberate the world from
the
Judaism.
Jew.
Yeah, because that's money
Yeah.
and
From the envious God Israel, like
it's true,
yeah,
and you
yeah.
find it in the early Nietzsche and his Birth of Tragedy. Basically, that we
Mhm.
live in a world in which modernity is basically a 2,000-year-old conspiracy between Socratism and
Mhm.
Judaism and
Mhm.
so on and so forth. And what you first of all, this philosophical fantasy, it wasn't really a populist. It was a very complex philosophical idea. Itself a philosophy of history. What you see in the protocols of the degeneration of this to the age of mass politics, right? This idea that would have required Marx, a complex pamphlet. It required Nietzsche a whole book on the birth of tragedy. You had Eugenie Düring, you had Sombart, you had
Rimbaud.
Omar,
Yeah. Mhm.
But then you had this coming in the form of this populist, authorless, plagiarized form
Yeah.
that is very suitable for mass politics and mass society. I mean, it's really at the eve of the birth of the 20th century, and the descending to that level of popularity where this philosophical, pathological image, really, of understanding of the world really then becomes one of our foundational myths of the modern world. And sadly,
which is so bizarre, because like when I read like Maurice Joly, I couldn't believe it, because like it was like he's fighting not the Jews, he's fighting Napoleon III. So because like he like the first populist leader, like being absolutely like this argument like was basically, you don't have to decapitate your subjects if you got like a press, and if you are capable of like influencing them by like symbolic means, etc. So basically everybody who's fighting the Jews is fighting modernity, is it?
What they think is modernity. I mean, I don't want to give it an ontological status, because it's already this full of fantasy to begin with. I mean, modernity, I just wrote something about this on my Abrahamic Metacritique. I'm trying to say that modernity itself, in my opinion, is a discourse. It's literature. It's endless self-commentary that's commenting upon its lack of self. It's just so if you really believe that, if you really actually hear that discourse, and then and you think that you're living in something called modernity, this self-contained epoch, in which all the dissatisfaction, the different satisfactions of life, whether in your own personal life or around you, can then be harmonized in this a unitary principle that's causing
principle.
then the leap from there to saying that this modernity is Jewish, I think is not. So I think there's a problem with the discourse of modernity itself, and ultimately, if you go beyond it, I mean, I'm becoming more religious in the way I think about a lot of
this.
That basically, what you have a complete dissatisfaction, a discontent with life. I don't think that life. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I know that modern life changed a lot of things radically, but I'm not entirely sure I would have been much happier living in the 15th century and having to go, in the winter to go to the bathroom.
The witch hammer, by the way,
So I think that discontent, Christianity. I mean, modernity is post-Christianity. I mean, post-Christianity is another word for modernity. And I think even what's really funny, I tell my Muslim friends, I think Muslims are post-Protestants. That's what they really are. They pretend that they are something else, but they're really just post-Christian.
I would say so. You're right.
Yeah.
Post-Christian modernity is another word for post-Christianity. Now, religion has a ways to provide a sense of content within a world that always will be a cause of great discontent. Now, all revolutionary ideologies of the 19th century hated that. I mean, that's why Marx said it's the opium of the people. It's providing you a sense of content while you have to be discontent about your oppression and exploitation. And it wasn't Marx alone. That was kind of the idea. But regardless of the political consideration, let's say that we did a Faustian deal. The Faustian deal is that we're gonna sacrifice that level of content in exchange of our real ability to enhance our materialist conditions. But the problem is that this fascinating ideal is self-defeating, because that means no matter how much you enhance your materialist conditions, you're not going to be content, because you already precluded content from
you're lacking transcendence.
Exactly. You're promised it, but the promise itself is self-negating. That is, you promised ultimate content, but you already have committed yourself not to be ever content. Now, you can take all of this and make it a problem with modernity, or a problem with Jews, or a problem with Zionism, or we're being oppressed, or capitalism, or imperialism, or American, or Pax Americana. I think it's just masks for the same issue that people became psychologically unstable, with destructured personalities that no longer have boundaries. I mean, and that's really comes, I think, with postmodernity, that really lays
identity crisis.
Right.
If you are a science fiction author tasked with imagining the Levant, but also your home country, Egypt, at the end of the 21st century, well, what would it look like?
It looked like in a better way, you mean, than it is now.
Well, it could be
you might
either
dystopian or utopian,
or dystopian,
like, whatever you want. Or two stories.
Well, yeah, the fairy tale that's not going to happen is that basically you have the Arab Gulf countries who are trying to lead themselves outside of the 20th century, right? We talked about the disaster that has been 20th century revolutionary thought. They're trying to get themselves out of it. So the best, now there's a lot of resistance for them getting out of it, not just from actual regional powers, Turkey, Qatar, Iran, but also you have the international left is resisting them. Who's also in bed with those others, right? So you have the world university system and the world mainstream media system and the world leading cultural institutions are against them. They are all for Palestine, and they think they are betraying Palestine, and so on and so forth. So in the best, somehow that will end. I don't know how. That's the thing. You don't know. Somehow, maybe President Trump will turn the elite universities into hotels, and that will... And that will stop the flow of all of these wonderful PhDs with awful ideas about the world, and that will free people, maybe, or powers, politicians who are Machiavellian and shrewd in the Middle East, to try to get out of this whole delusion of Palestine, and then slowly walks us. So that's a possibility, but I think it's too optimistic. The other possibility is that we move towards further disintegration. I mean, Western societies themselves are going through, I don't know what is the future of Europe. It doesn't look good. And that's a big part of the stability of the world. It just, the rising levels of discontent. We just spoke about discontent. Now you have, everybody has discontent in Europe. And if things keep continuing that, I don't know if there will be a great European civil war in the future. I hope not. But just does not look good at all. In the Middle East itself, I think those Arab Gulf countries think that they had a fantasy 5 years ago, maybe, during the time of the Abraham Accords, that they will be able to lead the region into another reality, become kind of the leaders. And of course, there's self-interest. So I'll become the leader, the power, the dominating power in this region that's going to be prosperous, and so on and so forth. I think they're starting to realize that this might not actually happen, and they need to focus on themselves. So just create themselves as an oasis in this very troubled region. Now, Israel is in a very difficult condition. I mean, today, I think Israelis and the world Jews at large, I don't think really an exaggeration at all to say that they are facing their toughest moments since World War II.
Yes. Yes.
And it's not going to, the amount of hatred that unspeakable numbers of people have for Israel, not just in the Middle East anymore, is absolutely terrifying. And Israel can only rely on the strength and the strength of its allies for protection. But if it's the allies, primarily Western Europe and the United States, are now facing these huge uncertainties about their own future, So yeah, I think, yeah. So it's not that I have a dystopian specific dystopian. So I think it's just a
There's
noble,
no leaning.
yeah, leaning towards greater greater crises, and that's what I hope. What I hope my writings do in trying to actually, I'm trying to diagnose a dead patient, the patient's already dead. I'm just trying to actually trying to help people clarify or gain some clarity, people who are related to the Middle East and people in the Middle East who care about these things, about what happened in this last century, in order to help them ask more serious questions about themselves. Forget about politics,
Sure.
about what they believe about the world, about how they feel about the world, about how they believe it in themselves, and whether they want to waste their lives dedicated to, I'm not going to say wrong ideas. I'm going to say just completely uncertain. No one knows if any of this is true. And is this worth gambling your future, your family's future, entire societies, in ideas about history and inevitabilities and realization and fulfillment and existence and so on and so forth?
Hussein, thank you very much
Very
for the
much.
conversation. It was really fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Same here.